First reading of the Leipzig Connection by Peo Leone. We're going to start in chapter 1. Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt was born in 1832 in Neckarau, a small town in southern Germany. Wundt entered the university at Tübingen when he was 19, transferred to Heidelberg after half a year, graduated as a medical doctor. From that university in 1856. He stayed at Heidelberg for the next 17 years, working first as a professor's assistant and later as a professor himself in the field of psychology. Psychology at that time meant simply the study of the soul, psyche, or mind. In 1874, Wundt left Heidelberg to take a position as professor of philosophy at Zurich. He stayed there for only a year and then accepted a chair in philosophy at the University of Leipzig in Germany. He was to remain at Leipzig for the rest of his academic career, eventually being appointed rector of the university. Wundt died in 1920. Those are some of the vital statistics. What they omit is that Wundt was the founder of experimental psychology and the force behind its dissemination throughout the Western world. To Wundt, a thing made sense and was worth pursuing if it could be measured, quantified, and scientifically demonstrated. Seeing no way to do this with the human soul, he proposed that psychology concerned itself solely with experience. As Wundt put it, it truly appears to be a useless waste of energy to keep returning to such aimless discussions about the nature of the psyche, which were in vogue for a while and practically still are, instead rather of applying one's energies where they will produce real results. Germany was the center of civilization. Its scientific and technological advances were well known. The Germans excelled in the application of scientific terms and procedures to previously non-scientific areas. Hegel at the University of Berlin had proposed to make of history a scientific subject. He became Germany's leading philosopher, emulated by a generation of students. Karl Marx injected Hegel's theories with economics and psychology, developing a philosophy of dialectical materialism. Herbart and Fechner applied mathematical principles to learning. Muller and Helmholtz grafted physiology to behavior. Fritsch and Hitzig applied electrical stimulation to the brain to determine the relationship of brain functions to behavior. Throughout the revolutions and revolts of 1848 across Europe, the rise of the Socialist Internationals, and the forced unification of the new Germany by Otto von Bismarck. Germany was a flourishing center of culture and the sciences, each of its universities a magnet for the ambitious intellectual youth of Europe and the United States. Leipzig was no exception, and one of its principal attractions was Wundt, who was attempting to place his ideas within the mainstream of German scientism by redefining psychology as a physiological rather than a philosophical subject. Soon after his arrival at Leipzig in 1875, he had established the world's first psychological laboratory. Initially small and primitive, it soon increased to 11 rooms. He supplemented his new laboratory with a journal, Philosophical Studies, which became the official organ of both the new laboratory and the newly redefined science of psychology. Wundt stated his overall intention in clear terms. The work which I here present to the public is an attempt to mark out a new dominance of science. Wundt's basic approach was to gather data concerning psychological responses in order to clarify how the individual experienced feelings and sensations. He was convinced that perceptions and experiences could be understood through measurable psychological reactions. Wundt noticed that reactions began with stimulation, followed by 1. Perception, in which the experience exists within the individual. 2. Apperception, in which the body, or so he thought, identifies the stimulus and combines it with other stimuli. And 3. An act of will, which results in 4. A reaction to the stimulus. What was will? For Wundt, will was the direct result of the combination of perceived stimuli, not an independent, individual intention as psychology and philosophy had, with some notable exceptions, held to at the time. It seems at times Wundt was the kind of person who is particularly likely to be underestimated. His personality was not significantly picturesque to make him stand out on that account, and his work shows no single brilliant contribution to knowledge that can be readily circumscribed and labeled with the phrase. His great achievement was to bring into effective relations of many things which, it is true, had existed before, but which had not been integrated into an effective organization. And somehow human beings are prone to regard such achievements as less striking and less creative than those of the order of Helmholtz and Fechner's. But the man who sensed the movement of scientific thought, as Wundt did, who embodied them in his first laboratory, who gave them the form in an influential system, and who imported them to enthusiastic students who were proud to carry on his work, has no small claim to the title often accorded him, that the father of modern psychology. One himself was not unaware of the debt psychology owed him, and not altogether indifferent as to whether or not it was recognized. In his role as father, he inclined toward the patriarchal, almost toward the papal. He reserved the right to speak with authority, to pronounce ex cathedra on psychology and psychologists, and to draw a distinct line of demarcation between authentic psychology and psychology of which he did not approve. Even today, so great had been his influence and prestige, the term experimental psychology to many still has as its first connotation the kind of psychology which was taught in Wundt's laboratory, or which Wundt recognized and approved. Wundt made two major contributions to the transformation of education in the West. The first was theoretical and will be taken up here. The second is addressed in the next chapter, The Empress. Wundt asserted that man is devoid of spirit and self-determination. He set out to prove that man is the summation of his experiences, of the stimuli which intrude upon his consciousness and his unconsciousness. In directing the work of his students, he focused their energies on minute examination of sensory perceptions in an attempt to dissect and quantify every aspect of action and reaction. What determined the difference between one individual and another in reaction time to stimuli? Why do some individuals combine stimuli differently than do others? What are the laws of the associations that can be formed between words? Wundt and his students regarded such questions as paramount. A highly respected psychologist, Wundt established a new psychology as a study of the brain and the central nervous system. From Wundt's work, it was only a short step to the later redefinition of the meaning of education. Originally, education meant the drawing out of a person's innate talents and abilities by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, literature, rhetoric, etc., the channels through which those abilities would flourish and serve. To the experimental psychologist, however, education became the process of exposing the student to meaningful experiences so as to ensure desired reactions. Learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying sequences. If one assumes, as Wundt did, that there is nothing there to begin with but a body, a brain, and a nervous system, then one must try to educate by inducing sensations in that nervous system. Through these experiences, the individual will learn to respond to any given stimulus with the correct response. The child is not, for example, thought capable of volitional control over his actions or of deciding whether he will act or not act in a certain way. His actions are thought to be preconditioned and beyond his control because he is a stimulus response mechanism. According to this thinking, he is his reactions. Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Pavlov, who studied psychology in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and American behavioral psychologists such as Watson and Skinner for lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, for schools oriented more towards the socialization of the child than toward the development of intellect. Learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying sequences. If one assumes, as Wundt did, that there is nothing there to begin with but a body, a brain, and a nervous system, then one must try to educate by inducing sensations in that nervous system. Through these experiences, the individual will learn to respond to any given stimulus with the correct response. The child is not, for example, thought capable of volitional control over his actions or of deciding whether he will act or not act in a certain way. His actions are thought to be preconditioned and beyond his control because he is a stimulus response mechanism. According to this thinking, he is his reactions. Wundt's thesis laid the philosophical basis for the principles of conditioning later developed by Pavlov, who studied psychology in Leipzig in 1884, 5 years after Wundt had inaugurated his laboratory there, and American behavioral psychologists such as Watson and Skinner for lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy, for schools oriented more towards the socialization of the child than toward the development of intellect. And for the emergence of a society more and more blatantly devoted to the gratification of sensory desires at the expense of responsibility and achievement.